I'm now going to show you some additional lighting techniques you can use to create some pretty neat effects. Um, First thing I want to do is because the size of our scene and what we're trying to create as a larger scene is still way too small, and I want to keep the terrains still at the size they are. In the atmosphere editor, what I'm going to end up doing is increasing the aerial perspective up to 10, which is essentially going to fake or increase the density of the atmosphere to basically increase the scaling of the entire scene, or give the illusion that that is being modified. It gives us a nice haze. I'm just going to do a quick render, take a look, and you'll be able to see just how it fades out. It reacts really well with the current shader setup. And the next thing we're going to be doing is modifying the lights in order to pick up on some of the highlights a little bit better without having to modify the materials any further. So we have a nice bit of atmosphere there, adding to that. Now, at one point I did end up modifying the material on the primary terrain, making the panels smaller. I'm just going to go back really quick and modify that scale and bring it back to where I had it before, because I don't think it works at this scale. So I just increased that size. The next thing I want to do is create another distant light, or basically another sunlight. We're going to use this for a couple of different things. One thing I like to do, so we're going to add a directional light, which is a sunlight. And if you're using an earlier version of View, earlier than 7, you don't have options or the ability to use graphs, you can just copy the orientation from the sunlight over to the directional light. But what I'm going to do is use a graph to add an input node external dependency, select the sunlight orientation, and connect that to the orientation of the directional light. I'm also going to add in a math node vector operation offset, and just create a very slight offset, so negative 0.5 on the X, 0.5 on the Z, and let's say 0.2 on the Y. So a very small change. I'm also going to go to the color of the light and darken it. And just make sure that the RGB values are equal, because I don't want any color out of it. And then what I'm going to do is double click, and instead of using the hard shadows, what I want to use this for is to create shadow maps or soft shadows. So I'm going to set this to auto size. The higher we increase the ratio, the sharper the shadows are going to be, so let's go ahead and bring it up to 2. We could also set a softness amount if we want to blur it further. My main goal here is to just really add a little more shadow overall without having to use the ambient occlusion. It'll create a pretty nice looking effect. I'm going to reduce under the Sun tab the pitch of the sun. This will also automatically modify that new distant light that was just added, because they are linked together, but with a slight offset. And it's a very minimal effect. It can really only be seen, or mostly seen, in the darker shadow areas where they're overlapping. You get some nice blending between the two different lights. I am going to go back to the graph and set this to negative 1.5 on the X and 1 on the Z to give me a little bit more of an offset. because I don't think that was quite enough. It was a pretty small amount, and you don't want to go too high with it. But you also want to have just a slight shift, because it just picks up on highlights and makes it easier than going into the materials and modifying and creating custom shaders for everything. So this way it's kind of an overall lighting system for everything. Now if you want objects that are not going to be affected by this, you can go into the exclusion modes using the include or exclude functions within the light editor. I also like this technique specifically for this type of terrain, because what it does is balances out the lighting, and by making it come in from a slightly different angle, we can remove a lot of the jagged edges that would typically show up on a terrain, and it just creates a more even lighting. Now if we want to not have this light controlled by the atmosphere editor, which it currently is by default, go to Atmosphere Editor, and under the Light tab, there is an option to apply settings on the bottom, and it's basically these global lighting adjustments to only to the sunlight or to all lights. So actually, I did say that wrong. By default, it is set to only to sunlight and with the scene. So I am going to set it to all lights to also modify that directional light and see how that's going to show up. There's a lot of different ways it can pick up and create interesting looks for the way the shadows are bouncing off of things. And it doesn't look too bad. Now that it is controlling all the lights, if we go to the atmosphere editor, anytime we make a change to the intensity, ambient light amount, light balance between sunlight and ambient, going between the sunlight and the ambient is going to increase the shadow density of all the lights. So not just the sunlight, but all of them. So just bringing that up to 84 just to take a look and see the intensity of the shadows. You'll see a dramatic effect, big difference. So I definitely liked it better the other way, but this just gives you an idea of that overall control. I'm going to bring it down a little, and go ahead and check only to sunlight. We're going to manipulate the other one manually. I'm going to go to that directional light, and let's just set up a bit of a softness. I'm also going to turn off the point at camera for both of these lights, just to make sure that is not influencing their direction at all, which sometimes that can happen. And when you're using the combination of the hard shadows and the soft shadows, they do basically intersect each other, and the soft shadow ends up having the same edge as the ray trace, and that's another reason I like to add a little offset. It does slightly go outside of it, but then the shadow inside of it is using the shadow map and creates a really nice just variation in the lighting. And what I was talking about before, going to that light settings, you can go to the Influence tab and then check different objects on or off, and also adjust specular or diffuse lighting. And that's going to be useful because what we're going to do is add another light to the scene. Let's also go ahead and move this over to where we can see it in the view. So moving that by the camera. And what I want to do is edit the light, go to shadows and just turn off shadows, go to influence, turn off the diffuse lighting. All we want this to do is modify the specular light. So we can add an additional specular layer and pull out some really neat details that wouldn't normally be picked up by the light. So you really just can kind of adjust this and pull out what highlights you want. But it won't affect the diffuse lighting and it won't create shadows. All it's going to do is give us uh, an extra highlight and influence the specular light on the objects. So kind of the way a shader does for a material. But this way we can just apply it to everything. It doesn't really look like it's picking up too much of the highlights. I will go ahead and adjust the settings a little further. Maybe come from the back a little bit. So we do have some different areas showing up. We could also modify the color to influence the highlights a little differently. And it gives us a neat effect. I am going to go to the atmosphere editor, sky fog and haze, and take the scattering and bring it up to 0.68. Aerial perspective, I'm going to bring down to 6. Add a little bit of fog, increase the intensity, and take our glow and bring it up to about 16. And I think the tonal range is a little bit better now. I still would probably make some modifications to the contrast, but for the most part, you can see how you can modify the light, really get some different softer effects if needed, or harder effect if needed. I'm also going to go to that directional light where we have the shadows, and take the shadow map, the ratio down to 0.2. And increase the shadow density up to 120. So now the shadow intensity of the map is much more diffused, spread out more. What the ratio does is 1 equals the size of the frame. So if you reduce it, it ends up decreasing the crispness, and increasing it will give you a harder shadow. There's also some of the other settings, the bias and other relationships, but we're not really going to get into those because those are really going to be very much dependent on the scene, and in this case it's not really anything that's needed. And so we can see the highlights a little bit better, I'm going to just modify the position of the camera. We could also go into one of the materials, go to the highlight, and I do want to note that the highlight intensity for that fake ambient occlusion layer will override what's underneath it. Even though it's being blended, it will still blend together, but it can reduce the highlight. It does look like my highlight intensity is turned down. So I'm going to go ahead and crank that up a bit, make it a little shinier, and that might have been just something I overlooked. Because there's so many lights, you can still see somewhat of a highlight, but it wasn't very noticeable, and that was probably why. So just going into the terrains that I have left in here and adjusting this highlight. No variable highlight set up on this. So let's go ahead and take a look. It should look a little shinier in certain areas. So those additional highlights are a lot easier to see now. It's really just picking up some of the finer details. If you go ahead and look at this from another angle, we'll be able to see that bluer highlight effect. So it basically adds to the ambient light in a way by making it more blue. But sometimes just the basic lighting by itself in the setup. Doesn't really give you what you want, so you can customize it that way. And I'm going to go back and reduce the aerial perspective a little more, because it does seem a bit too intense. I'm also going to go to the atmosphere editor, under light, increase the sunlight amount, go to sky fog and haze, reduce the sky ground density, decrease a little that fog and glow intensity, and see what we can come up with there. And that's a pretty nice contrast. I do have the quality boost on the terrains turned down still, so towards the back they just look awful. What I could do is just kind of zoom in a bit to look at the terrains a little closer. And I'm going to go ahead and save this version, and we're going to take a look at more of a night lighting, taking the sun, really bumping that down. Let's bring it up to 1 degree. See how that's going to look. Because what I'm going to be doing is creating some additional modifications for the light. Now in this case, that secondary specular light looks very interesting. It creates a really nice eerie glow, but it might be a little too defined. That would be good, however, for, say, representing the moon. Really, I think that this needs a variable highlight for the materials, because some of the highlights are just too bright. We don't really have a nice diffusion of the highlights. So what I could do is connect whatever's to connect to the diffusion using the Ambient Occlusion image map, and also subtracting the highlights from that. I am going to turn off that secondary specular value. I just go to our main terrain, select variable highlight. Oh, not on the AO, but on the base. And we can connect this to the same as our diffusion. And if we need to adjust the contrast of it, we can, but I think that should be alright. Right there. Maybe make it a little bit duller. We could also add in the anisotropic highlighting and adjust the color reflected light to make it a little more metallic. And that's a pretty nice early morning sunrise. Because I have the shadows turned up so high for that shadow map, it is creating some very dark areas, so I'm going to set that to 95. Just get rid of that softness. It's a shadow map. Doesn't really need any additional softness. I think it's okay. And now what I want to do is go back to those materials that we had before, using the luminosity based on the slope, and I want to do that for the intersecting materials. So we can add a layer, just hit the X, change that color over to whatever we want the light color to be. I'll just choose my fire shader, or fire map. Altitude range, open it up all the way. Slope range, let's go ahead and set it to 0.82. We really want to broaden this a little bit more. It can help with the overall look of this. Go to the effects and increase the luminous value. Go to bumps and make sure we're adding. And let's go ahead and add 0 to it. And rename this lights. Go to our other terrain and we can just really quickly do the same thing, since it's a very simple setup. And increase the luminous value. Go to the bumps, add 0. Ah. Now, because I did clip out the top of these terrains, there are flat areas, so we do need to be a little more restrictive about the slope along the top. Go to the environment and set that slope to 0.9. And the other one doesn't look like it's clipped as much, so we might be okay. If we noticed still too many flat areas, which I do right now, I can go ahead and adjust that one as well. Now, maybe that looks pretty interesting, but one thing we can do is illuminate the scene with those lights. And I am going to go ahead and turn up my quality boosts on the terrains a little higher for all of them, especially for the ones with the lights, because those are really going to need it. For even more quality, you can turn off the fast shadow option, although I usually don't do that unless I'm working with shadow maps, just because the ray tracing takes a very long time to calculate with that option checked off. So going to the atmosphere editor, we can change the lighting model. And basically, in order to illuminate the scene with any sort of luminous material, we need to use radiosity. So we can add or turn on the radiosity and then adjust our gain amount in order to increase the effects of the impact of the luminous value, setting that to, say, 1. And I also like to turn it up a little more to sunlight when I do this. Also, just for a very quick render to start with, I like to take the quality boost and turn it down to, say, for version 7, -2, anything with 8 and above, -1.5, because the quality boost did change the overall amount of quality within each number has increased. So then you can use smaller values. But this will just give us a nice approximation of what the lighting looks like. And then when we want to do a final render, we can turn that quality boost back up. So now those luminous layers are lighting up the terrain. And I'm just going to decrease the exposure for the moment. And you'll be able to see that a little brighter. What we can also do is if we want to have one brighter than the other, one have more of an impact, we can go to the material, none of the effects. We can go over the luminous amount of 100. If we set it to 300, it is going to create a stronger output. So that looks a lot better now because we're gaining way more of a light influence from that material. Like I was saying before, we can also increase the gain in order to go over the luminous amount, which could help keep the color of the lights from going white. But I like the variation right now because we have different lighting quality overall. We could also modify that luminous so it doesn't have to be 100% all the way across or 300, or we can, since it is a numeric value, connect it to any fractal, or even connecting it to our image, altitude, slope, subtracting with different noises to create patchy amounts instead of just having these lines. Lots of things we could do with that. And of course, the higher your quality boost, the more detail it's going to pick up. Usually a value of 0 works well enough. I typically stay with a low quality boost just because I do a lot of post work. Also, I'm impatient and don't like to wait for renders, which is why I always end up finding a way to render everything a little quicker, doing different techniques. So going back to the atmosphere editor, if we want to turn off the optimize for outdoor rendering, now this is going to increase render times as well. It needs to prep the radiosity first, but it will create a higher quality pass and illuminate a lot more of the scene. And for something like this, that can be very useful. Use it wisely depending on your quality amount and how many different objects you have lighting the scene, how many individual lights are going to have an impact. All of those will really play a role in how long it takes to render. I also want to note that the lume value from any thing in the scene, so if you were to create an ecosystem of lights and they had a material with the lume setting turned up, that will also influence the radiosity pass. I'm going to go back, turn on the optimize for outdoor rendering. Now the shadow smoothing, what this does is it takes basically the occlusion of the light that is part of the radiosity and just the overall pass and does smooth it out based on this percentage. You may notice that when it's first calculated, it's a really rough render. You might notice some harder edges. And I'm going to go ahead and decrease this down to 9, and we can take a look at it. But as it starts to render, then you notice going over, and there is a smoothing and a dispersion of the light. So if you want to keep that harder light or something closer to it, even though the prepass will also be somewhat modified by that setting, you can get a harder look to it by decreasing the shadow smoothing. So now we can see that instead of having these larger illuminated areas, we have what looks more like individual lights on specific areas. It's quite minimal at the moment because the quality boost is so low. I'm going to set this to 66%. Quality boost -1. What I also want to do is take the gain down to 0.5 and edit the ambient light color. First I'm going to go ahead and save it, just a copy of what it is at, and then I'm going to darken it. And that's going to really tone down the scene a lot, create some harsher contrast areas, and then the radiosity should have a better look to it. We could also move the sunlight below the horizon. Right now it's just slightly above, and because of our secondary light, it is slightly offset, and that could be up higher. So the lighting clearly looks better now, and because of the change with the ambient light, we're seeing more of that influence of the radiosity. And of course, the quality boost helps a lot. I could also choose to reverse which lights are going to be brighter. I'm just going to go ahead and switch these around, and we can see the difference because they are different amounts of geometry, different slopes, and have a different influence, and one might end up looking better than the other. So it's a good idea to kind of play around and check and see which one's going to work better. And I do think I liked it better the other way, so I will go ahead and switch that back. And then I'm going to go ahead and render this out with a little higher quality. And we'll be able to see all the details a lot better. So I know right now that's being rendered pretty small, and I know it's got to be a little difficult to see. So we'll go ahead, and I'm going to modify the quality boost, set it to 0. And really, I don't think I need to really modify anything else except changing the resolution. So I'm going to make something a little bit bigger. And if I planned on using this for compositing or taking it into Photoshop, making modifications, really the Z-depth is the main thing I want. Although we could turn on the multipass. Go through. I'm going to turn off the save disks. I'm going to save these out manually because I only need one or two. Go ahead to the Indirect Lighting, turn that on. Might as well keep shadows in there. And I don't really need to separate any of the individual materials. We'll could do the lights, and that way, if we want to modify the way they look, we can do that. But I like to have different file formats for individual images, at least when I'm just working with the still. Animation, that's a lot more difficult. So I'm just going to not save it to disk, and I'll save them out manually. So this is the final render that I got with the radiosity. I did end up changing the quality boost down to -0.5 instead of leaving it at 0 because it was just taking too long to render. Primarily because the quality boost on the terrains were turned up so high, and there's all of those square patterns, fractals everywhere. But overall, I think it looks pretty good. It actually ends up looking better, I think, without natural film response on. Just because I've modified the lighting so much. Turning on natural film response just didn't really look right. I really prefer, I think, without. I think it's just overall the contrast is better. But I plan on really playing around a little with it in post, and maybe even rendering some additional images with different lighting in order to composite that together. And a couple of compositing tricks you can do, which is kind of cool. I'm going to go ahead and save this really quick, is if you wipe out all the materials and just remove them from the scene. Just going to, I think I have to select them one by one and reset each material. Go to the atmosphere editor, increase the sun direction, modify that a little, and switch over to Ambient Occlusion, and we'll have to increase our range in order to get an idea what our current scale is at. I am going to just add a cube to the scene. Move that into position, and the scale of this is 6 meters. So comparing that to the features of the terrain, looks like 20 should actually be alright. 20 might even be a bit much. We could probably bring that to 14. Turn down the shadow smoothing a bit. And really just render this out with the Ambient Occlusion. If we want, we could also send it all the way to ambient, so just showing the ambient lighting. Just making sure multipass, I'm not really going to need some of the components. Just keep the indirect lighting, which will be the ambient occlusion. and this should render out much quicker. So now I can save out this ambient occlusion layer, or render, and use it in the composite. Completely separate from the other one, it'll blend together nicely. I can use Z-depth to subtract certain areas and, that are needed, but also pick up on a lot of shadows that I couldn't get before, especially some of the overlapping, different things like that. What I also like to do is sometimes I'll go through the material, and since they're all separated now, we could run new fractal distributions on them, just modifying color. And then if we want to render them ignoring atmosphere and lighting, you could use that as a modifying map. Let's just go ahead. I'll show you. Add in. Let's use a fractal. Changing the square patterns, these square stones, reduce the roughness a little. And we'll just do this with one. Ignore atmosphere and lighting. And I don't need to use any sort of special lighting situation for this. So it'll render much quicker. And then what we can see is a new texture we can use to overlay. And if we want to set up a couple of masks for each individual layer, since I did not render those before, we could go into the multipass and set that up in order to cut them out. But this way, if I want to add any new additional details or any new textures onto the surface, I have the ability to have that mapping. And even though it's going to be pretty flat and there's not going to be any shadows, I'm not going to need it because I'm going to be mixing that with the composite, say with different blending modes on different layers. So it's just a cool way to go back to the scene and break it down to just something very simplistic and add a bunch of new fractals to it that are going to work correctly and lay on the geometry correctly. So just some cool compositing tricks you could do. Now, because of the scale of the images used to create this set of scenes, they may not be available for the content, with the content. The compression worked out pretty good, so I'll see if I can incorporate them and get a decent enough file size to provide it. Or at least one or two of the scenes. Maybe not all of them. So you'll just have to check through the content folder and see what is available from this section. Otherwise, just start rendering out your own noises if you want to use this technique, because it is much quicker than rendering the procedurals.